Um, hmm, I think we should get started though. Jungju-sam, are you gonna start us off or do we
Yeah, I
just
have
get
a
started?
short introduction, not too
Okay.
long. Um, so, afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. or Professor Mary Komi Danico, Director of the Center for Oral History and also a Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And she's also a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Cal Poly Panoma. So Professor Danico's research focuses on anti-racism, anti-oppression, examining how sociocultural factors such as ethnic identity, gender, sexuality, class, family shape our communities. She's written extensively on Asian American identities, intersectionality, social justice, among other things, and her work often centers on oral histories as a key methodology. Among her publications, she's co-edited Transforming the Academy, Challenging Racism, Sexism, and Homophobia, and the 1.5 Generation Becoming Korean American in Hawaii, and has published an article on Millennial and Gen Z, Asian American and Latino identities. So she's currently working on the phenomenon of Hallyu as well. Please join me in welcoming Professor Danico.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hello, aloha from Hawaii. So wonderful to be invited by Professor Park to speak with all of you. So I'm really excited, and I'm going to start with some general introductions of myself, and then get into the topic at hand. So today we'll be talking about the importance of oral history in the digital world, and hopefully much of what we're talking about will resonate for you as you are all taking this really interesting class. I looked at the syllabus, so I wish I could take the class as well. So let me get this. Hold on one second. Trying to switch my slides and it's not quite going. There it goes. Huh. Things are not necessarily showing up. So hopefully everything else will be okay. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about me. I am a 1.5er, Ichimose. Was born in Seoul, Korea. And so you see this person right here, that's me. I think that's when I was in first grade in Korea. And then to the right is my mom and my two sisters. And then the bottom is my dad when he was in the Philippines. And behind me in this head here, that was the photo of the family that my dad would look at. And so, I was born in a time when Korea's GDP was far below the Philippines. We were the very first family to have a toilet in our neighborhood. And I realized later the reason why we got a toilet is apparently when I was 4 years old, I fell into the ditch. And then um, my uncle was about to go to the bathroom and found me, lying on the bottom. And so I had a lot of near-death experiences early on when I was a child. But my dad decided to move us primarily because he felt that Korea's political socioeconomic climate was very volatile, and he was very concerned about how young women, he had three daughters and one little boy, how we would fend in a Korea that was not very friendly at the time. As many of you who may study Korean history know, that was a very tumultuous period. And so, like my earliest memory really is about, you know, going to school and going on a field trip with my family and or with my mom in particular, and taking my shoes off, and really had a fun memory despite the fact that we didn't have a lot of the luxuries. And so I'm kind of curious to know, and if some of you, not all of you have to share, but if some of you are willing, kind of share like what are your earliest memories and what year was it? How old were you? Can I get a couple folks to kind of chime in, and you can use the emojis of raising your hand if you want to, or just unmute yourself and say something. But yeah, what are your earliest memories and how old were you? If you want to put in the chat box, you can do that as well. If you're shy, I'm totally okay with silence too. So, you know, I will ask for, I'm going to wait until a couple of people respond. Earliest memory. And so we have Jinsu. Thank you for raising your hand. Yeah,
Hi.
can you?
Hi. My name is Jin Seo, and well, one of my earliest memories, I think, was at home mostly, and I remember watching like I think Disney movies were one of my earliest memories, and just like listening to audiobooks, like children's audiobooks. Um, yes, I a lot of my earliest memories are associated with like fiction and fantasy. Uh, yes, I think I remember more of the stories that I grew up with rather than the people I grew up with. Which I mean, I know it sounds kind of sad, but it's yeah, I think yeah, those are my earliest memories, I guess.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And really, I think some of the stories, as you mentioned, is really the parts that stay with so many folks. And sometimes the stories are around the people as well. We also had someone else who had their hand up. The name just popped away, so I can't tell. Was it James? They changed their mind? I can't tell.
Hello.
Hi.
So my earliest memory, I think, dates back to when I was 5 years old. Because that's when I left Korea, and went to Paris, France with my parents. Um, Before then, it's all just recounts of what happened when I was younger, by other family members, which feels like an out-of-body experience. Like my aunts and my grandmother would recount how I would sing and dance in the living room for them. And I do not recollect. Maybe it's because I want to wipe it from my own memory. But I heard that most children like can recount earlier memories, but I can't for some reason. I think 5 is just the starting point for me.
Yeah, actually, I think 5 is actually the normal age. Very rarely, I think traumatic incidents or things that happen may have folks kind of trigger memories. But like as both of you are talking about, almost like snapshot picture memories. And we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of memories in oral history as we move forward. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And young ages, there are some pivotal moments, especially for those of us who left our home countries. So as you're sharing your experience, I'm thinking, hey, are you like a younger version of me? Because I left Korea when I was 6, but we moved to different locations. And so, when we were leaving Korea, as I mentioned, my dad was seeking for a better opportunity and better place for our family. And so, I always thought my dad was like the best, like such a good looking man. Like my dad is so handsome. And I used to think my mom was the most beautiful person. And I had no clue, as young children do, of what was happening in Korea. Didn't understand why it was a horrible, why we needed to leave. And we actually really hated the United States when we first moved over there. And so, we initially started going, we went to Guam first, and then we moved to Hawaii for a little bit. And we're just kind of wondering, would these places be home? Ironically, the view of Diamond Head that you see on the right and on the Acme Builders that's in Guam, the view of Diamond Head is actually right now the view of Diamond Head I see, very close to the view that I see from my condo that I live in. And if it was day outside, I would take the camera and show it to you. So it's somewhat serendipitous, I guess, in a way that I ended up back here on Oahu. But we ended up not staying, and my dad ended up taking us to the continent in terms of the continental United States. And I changed my name, and I know your professor heard this story before, but on the plane ride over there, they had asked us if we wanted an American name. And we thought if we had an American name, we'd be American. So I changed my name. I picked my name. after Mary Poppins. And so that's why my name is Mary. And I had no idea. My maiden name is Yu. And I had no idea that Mary Yu would haunt me because, I would get teased like Mary Yu, I would rather die, Mary, like it's just all these little things that, kids did. And I didn't realize that Julie Andrews and Mary Poppins was also British. I just thought that all white people were American. So, 6-year-old me had no clue. But we ended up moving to San Francisco, and that's where we ended up settling. And so my dad owned several liquor stores, and one in one of the more what they call dangerous areas in the Tenderloin, one in 6th and Mission. We had a restaurant at the Castro district, where it was predominantly queer community. And then we also had another liquor store near Berkeley. And so, my dad was a workaholic and worked really, really hard. And we lived in a very affluent area later on, but we were house rich and cash poor. So our lives were still very much like immigrant working class families, but we lived in a very nice house, but it was, had still very much a working immigrant mentality in many ways. And I'm going to also ask some of the postdoc students who helped set up the Zoom today, if you can help with the Q&A portion too, because it's hard for me to kind of navigate. So if you see some questions popping up and if you want to interject, please feel free to do so. And just let me know if anyone had a particular question. So after, growing up in San Francisco, my undergraduate was at UC Davis. And I always talk about how that whole undergrad experience was a complete blur. My dad at the time threatened to stop supporting me if I didn't transfer to Berkeley. And so I didn't want to go to Berkeley. And so I ended up getting 3 jobs, working 30 hours a week and graduating in 3 years. So that's why it was such a blur. I was just trying to get out as much as fast as I can. And I ended up working in a weight loss industry, and I learned quite a bit. I ended up moving up the corporate ladder with a degree in sociology, ended up in business. And by the time I was 24, I was overseeing about 1,500 employees and was doing very, very well. But I decided I wasn't quite fulfilled in doing that. And so I told my boss I was going to leave. Every time I said I was going to leave, they promoted me. And it was funny because she said, "We're going to make you the general manager shortly." And I said, "No, I really have to leave." And so I applied to grad school. I so not prepared for graduate school. I had no mentors, zero mentorship. And I applied to UCLA, Riverside, and University of Hawaii. And so I was admitted to all the schools, but I ended up going to Hawaii because they gave me a free ride. And so University of Hawaii, I ended up working with the East-West Center, which was the premier think tank at the time, where they focus on relationships between the East and the West. And at the time, I wasn't really interested in that. And so I ended up just going straight into sociology instead and still got, 6-year support. But Hawaii turned out to be a really incredible blessing for me as a graduate student. I met my partner there, and a lot of wonderful things happened. But I also got to learn about Hawaii and its people. I did not want to go to Hawaii, believe it or not. Folks thought I went there because of the beaches and the hikes and just the nature. I did not like the oversaturation of tourism in Hawaii when I went there. I felt that it was a lot of cultural appropriation that was happening. And so it was just really not a place that I wanted to live. But I met some incredible Kanaka Maoris, Native Hawaiians, as well as people who had lived there during the plantation era. And they took me under their wings and I fell in love with Hawaii. And so when, after, moving away from East-West Center and thinking about interracial relationships, I even did tons of criminology where faculty members would ask me to work with gangs and research on gangs or crystal meth users of women who were pregnant at the time while they were using. Spent a year doing domestic violence evaluation, and then end up becoming a trained conflict resolution specialist and trained in mediation. And so I did a lot. I got a lot of different trainings, but I think it was this conversation I had with Dr. Hagen Koo that ultimately changed everything that I was doing. And he just asked me, "So where did you grow up? Where are you from? Were you born in the US?" And I said, "No, I was born in Korea." And I immigrated when I was 6 years old. And he said, oh, so you're a 1.5er. You're 1.5 generation. And I always was very proud. Like, I thought I was 0 generation. I didn't understand generational labels. I didn't realize that immigrants, the first to come to the US, are actually technically first generation. Second generations were those who were born in the United States, and you can use that label for any other country. And he called me a 1.5, and I felt I was really insulted. I felt like he was saying I was 1.5 of something. And I was very proud to be, 100% Korean. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but later on I found out I'm actually not 100% Korean. But at the time, growing up, I always thought I was 100% Korean. So I went home, called my mom and asked her, and she said, yeah, you're a 1.5er. That's what you are. So that comment actually led me to pursue my dissertation work on the 1.5 generation, becoming Korean American in Hawaii. And it was really bringing in the personal to professional. And to be completely honest, I really thought, hey, I'm a 1.5er. I can do interviews with 1.5ers. It should be very easy. It's completely different because the place and space in which someone grows up, and I use Bronfenbrenner's idea of person and environment and looking at the ecological model. Wherever we grow up and the surroundings around us, whether it's the neighborhoods or the food or the people, that impacts our ethnic identity. And so being in Hawaii actually was kind of difficult to really understand the Korean American experiences in Hawaii because it was very different from my own growing up in San Francisco. But it really was inspiring about learning about storytelling and oral histories. And I was doing oral histories and didn't even know it. It was really introduced to ethnic studies as a discipline at that time. I was mentored by ethnic studies faculty members because they were the only ones who really understood the idea of community-based research, understanding ethnic identity issues, very different from social sciences at a macro level. And it was also infused with a lot of history and understanding the importance of history, and intergenerational storytelling was just as important. I did incorporate sociological methodology of surveys, but I also conducted 12 oral histories as case studies. So afterwards, as the introduction alluded to, I ended up at Cal Poly Pomona, and I was there for 25 years. I know I look so young, like kidding, but I was there for 25 years, and it was my first job. And I thought I would end up being there forever. Although I always wanted to come back to Hawaii, and I was never embarrassed to tell everyone that someday I was going to return. And I'm not a millennial, but I manifested it and it kind of happened. And so I, was a professor of sociology, but I was also an endowed chair of Michi and Walter Wegland Endowed Chair, where she was a survivor of the Japanese incarceration, and Walter was a survivor of the Holocaust. And so my duty was really social justice oriented, which is my heart and passion. And so we were able to do tons of different kinds of programming. And so this just a very quick introduction, or a short introduction, I guess a little long introduction about myself. But full circle moment, I ended up back at UH Manoa. And I guess all of my years of coming back and telling folks I wanted to come back paid off. Daviana McGregor was the last director at the Center for Oral History. And every year when I saw her, I would tell her, hey, Davy, I really want to come back. And about 5 years ago, when I saw her again, I told her, hey, we got a place here. And she's like, wow, you're really serious. I said, yeah, I'm planning on retiring here after I'm done at Cal Poly Pomona. So my retirement plans, I retired from Cal Poly, so that's why I'm faculty emeritus. But I am new, but not new, because I am the senior professor here at UH Manoa. So it's kind of interesting. So at the Center for Oral History, it's really about celebrating community knowledge. I started off by asking many of you, what are your memories? And it really is about dipping into our storage. I mean, many of us are our own best hard drives, right? We keep so many different things. And of course, we can't keep everything because we tend to select the ones that are really important to us. But it is, if you think about a lot of different communities, especially those immigrants who may not be educated, maybe they can't write, or maybe they can only read at a 5th grade level, which some of my respondents' families, actually, they only graduated like 3rd grade in Korea, so they really couldn't read and write. Many of them told their history and they told their family stories verbally and through oral history. So the oral histories can come in lots of different forms, but it is a living practice. This is something that people did even before they began to write about it, right? Because writing and reading came later. The way folks transferred knowledge and the way folks preserved history and knowledge was through this oral method. And there's really an importance of multi-sensory ways of remembering the past. So some of us look at photos and help us remember. Some of us will hear stories from our relatives and family members that helps us remember. Some of us may journal. So there's so many different ways. Today in a digital world, many of us are recording, we're doing reels, we're doing, there's a lot of different ways that folks are capturing their own stories. But through the center, what we're really interested in is the notion of re-indigenizing oral history, practice, and in theory. The way oral history is done in the continental US is through very Western colonial gaze. And the way we want to kind of center it here is through indigenousness, not just Native Hawaiian. Indigeneity takes place around the globe. And just want to make sure that we're answering. Okay, I might have to reshare the slide. Oh, is it not coming?
That was my mistake.
Okay, are you able to see it?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, all right. So, many of you are learning about archives and digital archives. Have many of you watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? This archaeologist, this anthropologist that go out and he goes into this massive room with boxes and boxes of things. And a lot of times folks think of those rooms as archives. And actually, those types of rooms actually do exist. I've been to DC and been in various archival places, as well as smaller spots like in Pearl Harbor. And if you look at the image on the left, many of them are really organized, very pristine, where they are preserving artwork as well as letters or journals or newspapers or artifacts. And so it's quite interesting. Today, though, many of us create digital archives. I'm sure most of you heard about the Lahaina Maui fires. And what that really showed for many is that physical objects, while precious, and we can do as much as we can to preserve them, sometimes they can get destroyed through natural elements. And so the digital archives is one way of finding backups to the digital. I think it's always important to have the physical and the original, but the digital archives allows us to have backups in case something gets lost. I'm not talking about it in this particular slide, but we got a grant to do oral interviews with Lahaina Jodo Mission. It's a Buddhist temple in Lahaina that was burnt in 2018 and they rebuilt it and it just burnt down again and with the most recent fires. And what's different about this time is all of the temples burned, but also a lot of the homes in the areas burnt. So there are very few physical photos or material things that are still around. And so folks are trying to reach out to any type of digital photos of things that they had that people can, donate or share. And so we're doing this project really to help support them, to help preserve it. And one story before I move on with the rest of the ongoing with the presentation is that with the Lahaina Jodo Mission, there was a Vietnamese nun that was visiting Maui, and actually now she's living there, that when the fires happened, she went into the temple with the fires going and grabbed the Buddha statue and ran out with it. And she got, I think, 2nd or 3rd degree burns, saving the Buddha. But I was just on Maui yesterday and got to see the Buddha, at a different temple in a temporary setting. So it's pretty incredible. But I think these digital archives is a way of at least having some memories of the artifacts, stories that were in place. So how do we preserve history? You know, when you think about it, preservation, the old school way was interviewing and then transcribing, and it was just the text. Today, we actually do multiple ways of preserving, whether it is, we still do the traditional text transcriptions, but we also video record, audio record. And my thing right now is thinking about how do we activate these oral histories into a format that's accessible to many people. But the thing that I want many of you to also think about is with oral histories and preservations of archives is whose stories are being collected. If you think about in the past, especially those who have to write, the ones who are doing the interviewing or the ones that they're seeking out, they always tend to seek out folks they feel like are leaders or really prominent people. But they're everyday people in our communities and societies that make tremendous impact in our communities, yet we don't often hear their stories. And so who gets to tell their stories is something I really would like all of you to kind of think about. And is it only for the literate? Is it only for the educated that gets to have their stories transcribed? One of the great things about oral history is that you don't necessarily have to know how to read and write. You don't even have to speak perfect Korean or perfect English. In any language or in format is fine. You can do Konglish, you can have a mixture. But it is important to think about which disadvantaged communities do we never really hear from in oral histories, and even in terms of archives, to determine what is really truly worthy of preserving. And so those are some things that I challenge my team with. I have an associate director and about 11 graduate students and undergraduate students working with me. And really, when you think about re-indigenizing the way we do oral history, is through a very non-colonial gaze, right? And really thinking about whose communities that are we looking at. When you look at oral histories, it's really connected by oceans. And the idea of oceanic ethnic studies is really important. For the longest time, for folks of my parents' generation, and then even to some extent my generation, folks feel like we live in certain areas, but actually our movements are very nomadic and very fluid. As one of your classmates went to Paris, I went to the United States. I know that many folks went to Australia, Latin America, Canada, and other parts of Asia. And so when we think about our oral histories and the connections by oceans, is really critical for those of us who are from the Trans-Pacific. And even for those of us who end up going to Africa, there's a large segment of South Asian communities who ended up growing up in Africa during these various political tumultuous times. And so the indigenous oral history traditions, and I'm sorry that this is a bit blurry. I'll try to correct it and send it to Professor Park. But this map kind of shows the indigenous folks around the world. And the myth is, and I'm sure most of you know this, that indigeneity does not only mean Native American or Native Hawaiians, because in the continent US, that's how a lot of people think. It's very like monolithic lens about indigeneity. We have indigenous people in Japan, of the Ainu and Okinawa. There are people in Taiwan and the Philippines. There are folks in Latin America. There are people in Africa. There are indigenous folks who are originally from those places. For Korea, Koreans are, when you do research, they say the indigenous people of Korea, but because they're not necessarily, it's kind of a newer, they think of it like, I think the way they define indigeneity is the folks who've been there, but then been colonized or been settled by other places and are at risk of losing. I think we were actually, as Korean people, kind of at risk also of losing, but thankfully, every time I see resistance in Korea and folks, like combating the oligarchs, I'm so proud. I'm like, yes, like go Koreans. So I want to share a little bit about what indigenous approach means for us. And so I'm going to move my head a little bit so you can read it too. But this is, I don't know if you can hear me if I go backwards, but this quote is from an indigenous oral history book by Nepia Mahuika. And he's an oral historian from New Zealand. And I was able to bring him last spring to Manoa. Really wonderful, wonderful person, but has been doing the work to centering indigeneity. And what he talks about is the need to listen. The really critical component of Indigenous oral history is listening to our elders, or in Hawaii, they call them kapunas, but listening and really thinking about oral history as a collective, as an us, as opposed to just a me. And also finding value in the little snapshots of memories as well. I can tell you that I've done many oral history since I've been back on Oahu, and then just last weekend on Maui. The amount of information that people remember is fascinating. And it also has to do with finding the right kinds of questions and making sure that it's tailored toward the topic at hand. We always think about an aloha aina statement. You know, this is kind of a core value at the center, is that everyone who lives in Hawaii, and I would say anywhere else too, has a kuleana, which a responsibility to this land. And so when I go to Jeju Island, or if I go to any other places outside of Hawaii, I would also feel like I would have a sense of responsibility to the land. And the oral histories really do bridge generational gaps and cultural divides in ways that people don't really understand. Oral histories, even just through listening, you can imagine and see what was happening during that time, even if you weren't there. And it does transfer you over to a place that you didn't even know about. There's even a grant that we're currently writing, and I don't know if any of you might want to write one too. It's called the Hidden Collections of Hidden Communities. More and more people are interested in finding the voices of communities that we don't know much about because they never really had an opportunity to tell their stories. So it's really a way for us to honor the different voices of the common everyday people. And when you think about the way societies are built, it's not by the elites. It is mostly by the common everyday people, where our communities evolve and how social progress and social justice happens. Oral history is also a method. It is such a rigorous process that at Manoa and a lot of universities, they don't have to go through the Human Subjects Review Board. For those of you in social sciences, whenever you do research, you have to go through an IRB, which is an institutional research board that says you're not going to violate people's rights. And the way we do it is that the agency and the ownership of oral history is with the narrator, and we refer to the person being interviewed as the narrator. So after we interview them, they get to read the transcript and they can say, we don't want this in. Oh, I forgot something. Can I add this part in? I changed my mind. I don't want you to use it at all. They have full agency over their story. And I think that level of trust is key. It's very different from a lot of social science research, which I have as a sociologist done. Once they sign the waiver, it's done. But in oral history, we have a sense of responsibility to the narrators themselves. And we want to make sure that they feel good about it. One example, in Hawaii, some people speak pidgin. Pidgin is the mixture of Hawaiian Creole that evolved during the plantation era. And so they sound different. And so a lot of times the way people write is very different than the way they speak. And so when narrators see their spoken word in print, some of them ask us if we can standardize English their responses. And we do that for them if that's what they want. I actually love it when they speak pidgin or whatever language they come in, because that's part of one's culture, but that's not my choice to make. So whatever the narrator wants, that's what we end up putting in. And the final goal is really to preserve and celebrate the knowledge that they're sharing with all of us. And by the way, a lot of the photos that you see in the backgrounds are photos of our center people. So these are the actual interviews that take place. Sometimes it's out in the community. This was part of on the Big Island. Sometimes we do it in a studio. It's wherever the narrators are comfortable. But ideally, and I'll get into this, it has to be, pretty quiet, because otherwise it gets difficult to listen. So you have to have really good equipment to do this. Let me just check the questions really quick. So someone found the map. Thank you. Yeah, I'll let you know. The hidden collection is through the library archives. If you're talking about the grant, there is a call for a grant right now. It's due very soon. It's called the Hidden Collections. And if you're interested, after the talk, I can go on my computer and find that link for you. But we're in the process of applying for that grant. But I think everyone should apply if you meet the qualifications. And then the oral history as a product. And so for the longest time, the product was the actual transcript. Our predecessors, who was there for 40 years, Warren Nishimoto and Michi Nishimoto, they collected over 800 interviews during the 40-year period. I mean, just incredible, bandwidth of stories about the people living in Hawaii. And so they did publish books out of it, one is called Talk Story or Telling Our Story. And if you go on Scholarspace, which I'll show you in a minute, all of our transcripts are actually up there for public consumption. So for any of you who might be interested in going through the archives of these oral history, they're there for you. So we made it, and some people made a play out of it, which is kind of cool. Some folks make music out of the oral history. Some folks write biographies about key figures and so forth. So it's really interesting, but I'm trying to appeal to the younger generation. So we just had a workshop on how to create mini documentaries from these stories, or like reels that you see on Instagram, but a little bit longer than those. So we're trying to find ways to have oral history become more accessible and much more part of a public product that anyone can use. I don't feel like our histories, once people give permission, is something that we hoard and we just keep to ourselves. The more folks who know about the plentitude of these stories, the better. And so that's something that we're focusing on. And so I'm not going to get into too much, but the oral tradition versus talk story versus social science, the oral history, it is a clear methodology we have different research questions depending on the subject at hand. Talk story is just having conversation, just chit-chatting. And social science interviews are much more like rigid, and it's not as conversational. Actually, I take it back. When I did it, it was pretty conversational too. But many of us who are trained in qualitative research tend to have a clear interview schedule, and you kind of stick to it. We're much more flexible in oral history because we go where the narrator wants to go. So there's a term in Hawaiian called nalu, and the nalu means like you go with the flow, be flexible. If the narrator wants to move in a different direction, you go, but then you try to still bring it back to the topic at hand. So the research, there's a lot of research that goes into oral history before we even start it. So, we look at the archives that are out there. We try to find out much information about the people that we're going to be meeting with. Sometimes we don't have a lot of time. I just got back from a funeral of a bishop from Soto Mission here in Hawaii. He's 7th generation bishop who passed away from colon cancer. And we got a call from our predecessors, Warren and Michi, saying, would you be able to do the bishop's oral history? Now, I'm very firm on that. We're not a center for hire. We're just very short staffed and don't have the capacity to do a lot. But as a courtesy, we did meet him. And once we met him, we knew his story needed to be preserved. I'm so grateful that we were able to do that. And he allowed us to interview him. We interviewed him for 10 hours, 10 different meetings, because he passed away in June. And I still see him, and I smile at the thought of all the different wonderful stories. So we didn't really get to do as much background information on him because that research was kind of rushed. But basically, most of the ones that we apply for grants, it's very focused, just like any other research that you may do. And then we have very clear timelines that we develop. This is a sample timeline, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint slide with folks if you think it'll be useful. But this is just a sample timeline that we did of oral histories during COVID. And so all of those interviews were done via Zoom, but you can go and look at it later on, but it's just different time, months, and what we're going to be doing at each of the periods. And then we also even come up with a concept map. And one of our graduate students, Landon Tom, kind of came up with this, what we call it, like a spaghetti. And I think this was for the Palama settlement oral history. He came up with a different concept map and a structure of how do we think about how do we branch out into this web that connects together. And so it's really important to have an idea as opposed to just you're thinking, I'm going to wing it. It just doesn't work that way. Because you'll end up not getting to the idea or the topic that you're really interested in learning about. And then, finally you contact the narrators, whether it's texting, whether it's emailing, or whether it's through phone. And then we do the pre-interview. And the pre-interview is really about just getting to know them and for them to get to know us. It's not we don't record them. We're not, it's not a formal thing. We answer any questions that they may have, but it also gives us a time to get to know them. And we find out stuff that we didn't find out in our own research, which is always helpful. And so the pre-interview, I love that portion the most because that's when you really get to, they feel more comfortable. A lot of times people get a little nervous when they feel like they're being interviewed, but really they do loosen up quite a bit. And many of the folks feel good afterwards. There's one respondent I spoke to the other day. Afterwards, she talked about the Maui fires, and she said she felt like a weight was lifted off her after talking. And so, that's something that always makes us feel grateful. We also get messages from descendants of after their grandparents or parents passed away. And they said just listening and seeing their family members really made them feel like so connected to, found out about things that they didn't know, but also felt connected to their relatives. And that's always so rewarding for us at the center to have a small part of that and helping to preserve, people's memories of those that they cared about. So, at the pre-interview, we kind of begin to create an individual guide and also let them know what to expect. And then, this is kind of a flow of how the interview goes. And the interviews are, unless folks don't want to, is always recorded. We always have a backup recording. And then we also take notes while we're doing that. We have 2 people, sometimes 3, but always 2 people. And then, the recorded interview, I mean, just kind of very quickly, a lot of it's kind of common sense, but you'd be surprised, we always get there early. We bring a gift to our narrators. And so we usually bring a lei as a token of appreciation or a small McKenna or some kind of somewhere to give them. And then we meet at a time location that they want, not what's convenient for us, but what's convenient for them. And then we always make sure that the equipment works and always have backup. And that's really important. So these are some of the material things that we need. But then I really wanted to get into, because we're getting closer to time. Obviously, we transcribe, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. And someone asked me once, how is it to transcribe after you interview? I'm happy and sad to say that I don't do any transcriptions. I have a lot of our students and grad students do that, but they tell me that they learn so much from doing the transcriptions, and they probably know our subject narrators way more than we do because you do get an in-depth knowledge of people. But I did want to skip this section, and you can kind of look at it because I'm just being mindful of time. And just kind of after transcription, we process it and then we give it back to them. So these are just kind of like things that we do. And then really about preserving it, right? So having a plan of how do you archive this? How do you digitally archive this? How do we provide access to our narrators? How do we offer it to the communities if they need? A lot of time the storage space is an issue for community for digital archiving. So we have on our website, which I will show you in a second, that there are spots for community members to contact us. And if we feel like it's a topic that's really valuable, we have a community initiated section where you'll have oral histories done by community members themselves. And we've also collaborated with the Hawaii Public Radio, where some of our stories were on the radio live. I think we had about 10 different stories that the Hawaii Public Radio aired on a weekly basis. All right, so let me see if this works. Excuse me, I think I'm gonna have to get out of it for it to work. sadly. How do I stop the sharing? Let me see. Can one of the folks on here help me a little bit? Because it's not clicking on my PowerPoint. It would click, but it's not clicking here. Can you get me off the screen? Let me see. I'll kind of close
yeah.
the slide.
Oh, fine,
Okay,
yeah.
I'll close the slide. So let me see if I can just share the PowerPoint by itself. Let me see, where is my PowerPoint? Because that one didn't work. Sorry, folks. Let me see. Let me open it and then I'll share it. I think that might be the easiest thing. Hold on. Hold on 1 second. It's not really opening up, so let me just open up to the center. All right, let me see if this will work. Hold on. Okay. All right, can you all see this? Yes? Can you see it? Yes, okay. All right, so this is the Center for Oral History. Let me close this a little bit. All right, this is our website. And one of the things that I wanted to share is a lot of the transcripts that we have. And so if you're looking here, these are all the different oral history projects that we've done. So again, there are over 800 of different times. So there are things about communities, about government, different occupation, historical events that have happened here. So, you're welcome. And a lot of folks actually do take advantage of our archives and look at it. There are also different podcasts that you can listen to. So we try to think about how do we make it accessible is through, podcast experience. So the different life histories before statehood, Hawaii became a state in 1959, before when it was a territory to statehood. And then also some natural disasters like Hurricane Iniki or various labor political movements that happened. So there's a lot of different archives in there. And then the other thing, and tell me if you could see this when do you see the change? Yeah? Okay, great. So we work with the national parks. So all the national parks for the state of Hawaii and all the islands, we actually have done oral histories. So you can also look at Haleakala, which is on Maui. And so this is a story map. And so another way that we make our oral histories public and accessible is through this web format. So you can go in and look at the different notes on the oral histories. So you have a text about it. And then we also have like various videos. So these are individual oral narrators that we interviewed for this particular project. And then like Eric Anderson, who is kind of like the godfather of Haleakala in some ways, that, they also share a lot of their own personal pictures. So they offer their photos that we are able to incorporate into it. And then we put in different quotes. This story map was done by one of our graduate students, Alana Kanahele, a PhD student in geography. And so we have this also for several of the other oral histories as well. But I wanted you all to kind of get a sense of that because I think it's important to kind of see like different ways that folks are able to, let me see, hold on 1 second. Different ways that folks are able to, utilize the information. Let me see, is this it? All right, yeah, this is it. All right. And utilize the information that we have. So just wanted to make sure that you saw that. All right. So pre-interview. I feel like this is the wrong one, sorry. I think I have a lot of different things that I was working on for. I had to put extra work because I respect Professor Park so much that I wanted to make sure that it was done well. So, and that you all would get something out of it as well. So let's see. Right there it goes. Are you able to see my slide, my new slide? Does this show history and projects or no? Are you able to see history and projects?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
We can see
thank you.
oral history projects.
Okay. And then I just switched over to history of Waile'e. Are you able
Yeah.
to see that? Okay, great. So just kind of quickly going over some of the projects that we have. We currently have about 11 projects going on, but I'm just highlighting some of these. And this was done with the class. So one really fun way of getting classes and instructors to think about how do you incorporate oral history into a classroom is working with community partners. So Waile'e is in North Shore, Hawaii, where it was an agricultural farmland where the University of Hawaii for the longest time was using it to do experimentation on animals. But historically, in its indigenous form, it was a place of lo'i where taro roots were formed as well as fish ponds. And so this, a lot of Native Hawaiians, the Kanakas live off the aina, live off the land. And so they eat and they can sustain themselves just from the land itself. So these two young Native Hawaiian men have convinced University of Hawaii to lease the land to them for about 50 years, and they're doing restorative justice work on the land. And so the history of Waile'e, when you see the slides closer, if you all want to see it later, kind of shows where it was and where it is right now. And they're doing a phenomenal job of being able to support taro, which is the substance, the main key food for people in Hawaii, to a lot of the community folks at a very low cost and sometimes free. The other project we did with the community is Palama Settlement. And Palama Settlement, the woman in the purple, her name is Paula Rath, and her grandfather was the one who founded and started Palama Settlement. And she really wanted to do an oral history of a lot of the people who went through it. Palama Settlement is located in Kalihi, where a lot of underserved, minoritized communities live, mostly socioeconomically disadvantaged. They live in subsidized housing or government housing. And many of them end up going into gangs or getting into juvenile delinquent behaviors. But what Palama Settlement does is serve as kind of a refuge and a safe place for a lot of young people. So the people that you see there surrounding Paula, one owns a television company. One is a national football league. He's a football player. One person is a principal at a school, and one is a very famous Hawaiian musician. So, Brother Nolan sings this really fun song, and they're all talk about how Palama Settlement really saved their lives and how Paula Rath's grandfather and the family and the work that they continue to do at the settlement, now it's more of a foundation, continue to serve as a refuge for a lot of kids at risk who may not be able to go home and even eat. So they provide food for them. They have sports. So it's a really incredible space. And we were very lucky to be a part of that programming where we're able to help them with the oral history project. And then, the thing that many of you may know is that we have a lot of pride here in Hawaii about Korean immigration. Koreans have been are one of the older immigrants to Hawaii since 1903. And this woman named Mary, she's a photographer who went to Korea and took photos of old Korea from the time that she was a young woman. She's now living in Hawaii, but she was living on the continent for a while. But she shared in this one exhibit in a really great space, and this is in City Hall on Oahu. These are all of her photos that were surrounding this area where she talked about the transformation of Korea. I think the thing that people don't realize is that many migrant or people who emigrate or leave Korea, there is a sense of longing. There is a very, not for everyone, but for many folks, there is still a feeling of connection to Korea. Even for myself, as someone who left when I was 6, when people ask me, what do I consider home? I still consider Korea home. For some reason, whenever I go back, it just feels like home. And Hawaii is the same kind of feeling in San Francisco. I lived in Southern California for 25 years, and I still don't really feel like it's home. It's kind of funny. So this was a really well-attended exhibit where she showcased a lot of her photographs that she took over the period. And this is the 10th anniversary of television station KBFD in 1986. So I'm sure many of you, I don't know, in this room maybe weren't even born yet, but she has photos from even right during the war period of where people used to do their laundry in the Han River. And then even, different stories, even in Hawaii, of the Chamber of Commerce from 1954, and more photos of folks who have been here in Hawaii since the early periods. And these are descendants of folks who came over very early on. Ducky Lee Murayabashi and this is her on the far left corner when she got her degree from UC Berkeley. She is a North Korean refugee who ended up going to South Korea right after the Korean War. They were able to escape. And she ended up getting her undergrad at Berkeley and getting her master's in urban planning. But she is the godmother of Korean history in Hawaii. She holds the Immigration Museum in Seoul at Incheon. All of the materials that you will see there, if you end up going, was actually donated by this person, Ducky Lee Murayabashi. So pretty incredible. And she's going to be going to Jeju with me as well. And, these stories it's also kind of personal, because when you look at Abraham Pak and Lily Pak, he is their descendant. And so the pride that folks have of the very early immigrants to Hawaii, we still have folks who are 3rd, 4th generation who, remember a time when they've heard all these stories from their families about how they came over and worked on the plantation. And so he is actually an educator at one of the community colleges here. And I'm actually friends with his cousin. It was kind of funny. I know his cousin is also famous in Korea, Gary Pak. He's a writer and retired professor. So again, this is part of their family stories early on in Honolulu in 1926. So this is part of the exhibit. Really interesting to see, how life was like for a lot of the folks early on in the period. But what people don't really know much about is what I wanted to kind of end with is the Honouliuli. How many of you have heard of Pearl Harbor and the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, and then Executive 9066, which led to the incarceration of Japanese citizens? I would hope that many of you who study US history would have heard about it, because it was a really horrific event for 3 years, where people of Japanese descent were incarcerated. One thing that we're doing here on Oahu is doing an oral history of Honouliuli, which was the Japanese incarceration camp, which they called it Hell Valley. And this was a site where there are about 400 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated, but about 4,000 in total were there. The remaining of the folks, 2,700 of them, were of Korean descent. So when I went to walk around Honouliuli with the national parks folks, and we were learning about what happened, and because we're doing the oral history of how the park emerged and how President Obama declared it a national park, I was really fascinated that 2,700 people from Korea who were working in Japanese labor camps in Okinawa, in Saipan, in Guam, were swept by the US military after Japan lost and brought over to Hawaii. Many of them went through the immigration building, stayed in Sand Island, and they also ended up at Honouliuli. And they also sent over probably about 600 of them to Wisconsin prisoner of war camps. So in these POW camps, prisoners of war, we had Koreans and Okinawans living here. And I thought, my gosh, how horrible. They were forced to work in these Japanese labor camps during the Japanese occupation. And then they got swept and then put into an incarceration camp. What Ducky Lee tells me is that the Methodist Church was very instrumental in giving support for the Korean POWs. And POWs were often heard saying that Honouliuli, even though it was Hell's Valley because it was so hot, that the treatment that they received was a million times better than the Japanese labor camps, where many folks died of malnutrition, they're malnourished, starvation. And here they got 3 meals and they actually got to shower and so forth. The Okinawan POWs were not treated as well because the US military thought that they were Japanese. And Okinawans are different than people who are Japanese. They were also colonized by Japan and still remain to be colonized by Japan. So these are some of the photos of a Honouliuli internment camp where the POWs were there. And during this colonial period, from 1943 to 1945 is when they were over at Honouliuli, and they were released in 1946 or around there. And really, the notion of survivance story, Korea and Koreans in the diaspora are really directly and indirectly impacted by the Asian settler colonialism. And when you think about Koreans in particular, the legacy and the intergenerational trauma of Asian settler colonialism remains today. But these 3 draftees were really instrumental. And if any of you know them, I would love to talk to you because I would love to find their descendants. The grant that we wrote with the national parks is obviously not to interview the people who are prisoners of war, because sadly, most of them are gone. I think there's one remaining on Jeju who's over 100 years old. But we're looking to interview their descendants. And these 3 were instrumental in creating this free press for liberated Korea. They had 5 newspaper volumes. I think we have a copy of 1, and we're really looking for the other 4. But Lee Chang-sil, Park Hyung-moo, and Park Sung-dong, they were these ages at that time, 31, 24, and 25 years old, by the time 1945 hit. If folks know of their descendants, we would love to meet them. Even if they don't want to be interviewed, we'd love to just get to just talk story with them. Because I think they were constantly milling out stories about how to free Korea, which was Korea, as many of you know, was in such a turmoil politically, even after the end of the Korean War. And so these 3 college draftees, people don't really know that much about them, and these student draftees, were taken by the Japanese and then later, brought over to Hono. We call it Hono. And so we're really curious to really learn about what happened to them afterwards and what did they continue to do, especially with the free press, a free liberation of Korea. What role do they play? Especially like if they returned to Jeju in 1948 with the Jeju uprising, what role do they have in the Korea democracy movement? Those are things that we're really, really fascinated to learn about. So next steps is that very shortly, and next month, I'll be going to Jeju for a couple of days, observing and meeting some of the descendants of the draft of the POWs. And I'm observing the Jeju reporters do their documentary. So they've invited us to come along. So Ducky Lee and I are going to be going to Jeju and hopefully being able to do some pre-interviews with descendants who would be open to being interviewed by us for their oral history. They're also, it's a public list of the 2,700, and many of them are actually in Jeollado. And so we're also very interested in finding some of the descendants if any of the students here are interested in getting some research experience and also supporting the work that we're doing, I would really welcome that. I think even though I can speak conversational Korean, I cannot read and write. I read and write at a first grade level. I currently have undergrads and grad students who are doing a lot of translation of the Korean archival material. But when I'm in Korea, we are going to be recording if they agree to do so. And it would be really great for Korean students to also have that experience, because I think knowing that part of history really fills in a lot of gaps in our own personal identity. And I think Professor Park knows, very recently I found out that our family is related to Yu Guan-sun, that she was my great aunt. And these things would never have happened if we didn't kind of pursue, oral history and learning about history from folks. This was also helped by our genealogy book that my cousin has. And so that's how I was able to find out. But it made me just question even more. So this research has been personally very fulfilling for me to learn about, connecting it to how my dad took us out of Korea and into the United States because of the lack of democracy and worrying about rights for women, to this current research has been really a wonderful full circle moment. So mahalo nui loa, 감사합니다. If you have any questions, or if you want to stay in touch, it should be MYU, sorry, typo, myu@hawaii.edu. And yeah, that ends my presentation. So I think we have some time for Q&As.